The water is flat, waist deep, clear, the color of green glass, no surf, no wind, and in the summer of 2023 it killed more swimmers than any rough coast in America. Panama City Beach, Florida. 27 miles of sugar-white sand on a 200-mile shore, guarded at 3 small stands. The first answer is rip currents. But rip currents exist on every coast on Earth. Bay County's sheriff watched strangers drown trying to save children. 2 of them fathers, on Father's Day. The same trap took a steamship captain in 1937 and a 19-year-old in 2024, for the same physical reason. So hold that image, because you have to understand it before anything else makes sense. Most dangerous water announces itself. You look at a coast in Oregon or Northern California and every instinct you own tells you to be careful. The swells are tall, the water is cold and gray, the rocks are black. The whole scene is built to warn you. You respect it because it looks like it wants to hurt you. The Florida Panhandle does the opposite. It is engineered by nothing but geology to look completely safe. The water is warm. It is transparent enough that you can watch your own feet on the bottom in chest-deep water. There is often no breaking wave at all near the shore, just a gentle slosh against your knees. A 4-year-old could stand in it. Families drive 6, 8, 10 hours from Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee specifically because it looks like the safest ocean water they have ever seen. And for a large fraction of the people who die here, that first impression is the last piece of information they ever act on. That is the whole problem in one sentence. The thing that makes this beach beautiful is the exact same thing that makes it lethal, and they are not 2 facts. They are 1 fact. To understand why, you have to start with the sand, because on this coast, the sand is not scenery. The sand is the weapon. Walk down onto the beach at Panama City and pick up a handful. It is almost blindingly white, so white that on a bright day the glare off it can hurt. And it is soft in a way that ordinary beach sand is not. It squeaks under your feet, a faint, clean squeak with every step. That squeak is a clue. What you are holding is not crushed shell and not the yellowish quartz you find on most Atlantic beaches. It is nearly pure quartz, and it is astonishingly fine and uniform, the grains almost identical in size, rounded and small. According to work summarized by the USGS and NASA's Earth Observatory, that quartz did not come from anywhere nearby. It came from the southern Appalachian Mountains, hundreds of miles to the north. Over an immense span of geologic time, rock in the Appalachians weathered and broke down, and rivers carried the resulting sediment south. The Apalachicola River system delivered that quartz to the Gulf, and the relentless work of waves and currents did the rest, sorting it and grinding it and winnowing away everything heavier or darker until what remained on this stretch of coast was this: a beach made of mountain, milled to powder. Understand how long and how patient that process was? Because the patience is what made the sand so dangerous. This is not sand that was made in a hurry. The quartz that started in the Appalachians did not travel to the Gulf in one trip and settle where it landed. Over hundreds of thousands of years, through the great cycles of ice ages when sea level fell and rose by hundreds of feet, the rivers carried the sediment down and the shifting shoreline reworked it again and again, advancing over it, retreating from it, waves picking it up and dropping it and picking it up once more. An endless sorting machine running for a span of time the human mind cannot really hold. And a sorting machine that runs that long does something very specific to sand. It separates. Every time a wave lifts a mixed handful of grains and lets them fall, the heavier and darker minerals settle out faster and get left behind, or carried off in a different direction than the light, hard, durable quartz. Softer minerals get crushed to nothing. Shell gets broken down and dissolved. What survives after enough cycles is only the toughest and lightest fraction, pure quartz. and only the grains that have been rounded and reduced to a narrow band of nearly identical size, because the sorting has thrown out everything that did not match. The result is a sand that is close to 99% quartz, blindingly white, because there is almost nothing colored left in it, and made of grains so uniform that they behave less like ordinary sand and more like a single substance. That uniformity is why it squeaks. When you step on most beach sand, the grains are all different sizes, and they slide past each other quietly. When you step on this, the grains are so alike and so clean that they move together, rubbing in unison, and they produce that faint, clean squeak with every footfall. The reason locals and tourists alike call it sugar sand. It is a lovely detail, and it is also a warning written in sound, because the same uniformity that makes the squeak is the uniformity that makes the beach so flat, and the flatness is the whole engine of the danger. Coarse mixed sand cannot pack tightly because the different grain sizes leave gaps. Water pours through it, and it piles into steep, well-drained banks. This near-identical fine quartz packs down almost like a solid surface. Water drains through it slowly, and the wash of the waves can push it out into an apron so gradual that the beach barely seems to tilt at all. You are, quite literally, walking on the reason the water stays shallow so far out, and the reason it looks so safe. Here is why that matters, and it is pure physics, nothing mystical about it. The size of the grains controls the shape of the beach. Coarse sand with big irregular grains piles up steeply. Water drains out of it fast between the grains, so waves don't carry the grains far, and the beach face tilts down into the sea at a noticeable angle. You have felt this on gravelly or coarse sand beaches. A few steps in, and the bottom drops away and you are suddenly swimming. Fine sand does the opposite. The grains are so small and so uniform that they pack together tightly. Water drains slowly, and the wash of each wave spreads the grains out into a broad, low, nearly flat apron. The finer the sand, the flatter the beach, and Panhandle sand is about as fine as beach sand gets. Flat beach means shallow water, and shallow, far out. That is the piece people cannot see and cannot intuit. On a steep beach, you know the deep water is close because you can see the bottom fall away and the waves stand up. On this coast, the bottom keeps going almost level for a very long way. You can wade out 100 feet, 200 feet, and still be standing with your shoulders above the surface. To a family from 400 miles inland, that reads as one thing and one thing only. This water is safe because it is shallow, because I can stand up, and they are not being stupid. They are reading the water using every rule that has ever kept them alive at a lake or a pool, and every one of those rules is wrong here, because a lake does not have what this shape of coast builds next, because if it is this shallow, this gentle, this far out, what could possibly pull a grown adult under and not let go? That is the real question, and the answer is hiding in that same flatness. The flatness that looks like safety is the first link in a chain, and the chain ends in a jet of moving water strong enough to outswim an Olympian. Follow the chain link by link, because every link is visible once you know where to look, and once you have seen it, you will never look at a calm beach the same way again. It starts with those low, gentle waves. On a steep beach, a wave rolls in and breaks once, right at the shoreline, and it is done. On a beach this flat, the water is shallow so far out that waves start to feel the bottom and break long before they reach you. And then the broken water keeps traveling, reaches slightly deeper water, reforms into a smaller wave, and breaks again closer in. The flat profile doesn't just make one shoreline. Over months and years, it sculpts the sand underwater into a series of long ridges running parallel to the beach, sandbars. Not one bar, 2, 3, sometimes four of them, stacked out to sea, each with a lower channel, a trough, between it and the beach. Now watch what water does across that structure, because this is the engine. A set of waves, nothing dramatic, 2 to 4 feet, rolls in from the Gulf and breaks on the outermost sandbar. Every breaking wave is physically shoving a mass of water up and over that bar and into the trough behind it. Water is pouring into the trough, wave after wave, and it piles up. The sea surface inside the bar actually stands a little higher than the open Gulf outside. Water does not tolerate being piled up. It has to get back out. And here is the trap. It cannot easily go back the way it came, straight out over the bar, because the incoming waves are a moving wall pushing the other direction constantly. So the piled up water does the only thing left to it. It runs sideways, parallel to the beach, inside the trough, feeling along the sandbar for a weakness. And sandbars are not solid walls. They have gaps, a low spot, a break where two bars don't quite meet, a channel scoured out by a previous storm, or near a pier, the deep trench that the pilings themselves have gouged into the bottom. The sideways running water finds that gap, turns and pours through it out to sea. And because all the drainage of a long stretch of trough is now forced through one narrow opening, it accelerates. That is a rip current. It is not a wave. It is not an undertow that pulls you down. It is a river flowing away from the beach, narrow, fast, and it will happily run at 4, 5, even 8 feet per second in a strong pulse, faster than any human being on Earth can swim. And now for the part that should genuinely frighten you, the reversal buried inside the mechanism. The rip current is often strongest on exactly the days the water looks calmest and safest. People assume danger scales with visible violence. Big waves, bad. Small waves, fine. On this coast, that instinct is inverted and it kills. When there is a modest, steady swell, the kind of low 2 to 3 foot wave that a tourist looks at and calls beautiful, barely any waves today, that swell is doing steady, efficient work, pumping water over the bar in a continuous feed, keeping the trough loaded, and the rip jetting hard through its gap. The surf looks harmless, precisely because the energy isn't being spent standing up into big, scary breakers near shore. It's being spent, out of sight, feeding a current you cannot see until you are in it. The calmer and cleaner the water looks, the more confident people are to wade far out. And the farther out you are, the closer you are to the bar, the gap, and the throat of the current. Let me put a number on that current, because the number is the whole point. A person swimming hard, a fit recreational swimmer, moves through the water at maybe 2 or 3 feet per second and cannot hold it for long. An Olympic sprinter, at the peak of a 50-meter dash, tops out around 6 or 7 feet per second for a handful of seconds before the body simply cannot sustain it. A strong rip current in a good pulse runs at 5, 6, up to 8 feet per second. Read those numbers against each other, and the situation is not difficult, it is impossible. A rip current at full strength moves faster than the fastest human being who has ever lived can swim, and it does not tire. And it does not stop after 20 meters the way a sprinter must. So when a person feels themselves being carried out and does the natural thing, turns to face the beach and swims for it with everything they have, they are entering a race against a river that is faster than they are and will never get tired. And there is exactly one way that race ends. They swim as hard as they can. They do not gain an inch. Sometimes they lose ground, and they keep swimming because the shore is right there. They can see it. It is 50 yards away, and stopping feels like surrender. And then the muscles that were built for a minute of hard effort give out, because no one can sprint indefinitely. And a person who is exhausted in deep water and still 50 yards from shore is a person who is about to drown, not because the water pulled them down, but because it held them in place until they wore out. That is the piece almost nobody understands until it is too late. A rip current does not drag you under. It is not a hand from the deep. It is a treadmill. It keeps you exactly where you are while you exhaust yourself, and the drowning happens when the exhaustion wins. Which means the single most dangerous thing a person can do in a rip current is also the most natural, the most instinctive, the thing every fiber of the body screams to do. Fight it. Head for shore. Do not stop. The people who die here are very often not weak swimmers who panicked in over their heads. They are ordinary swimmers who did precisely what their instincts told them, swam hard for the beach, and lost the one race a human being cannot win. And there is a second cruelty layered on top of the first, in how the drowning itself looks, because it does not look like drowning. Everyone carries a picture in their head of a drowning person, thrashing, splashing, waving their arms, screaming for help. That picture is almost entirely wrong, and the gap between the picture and the reality is why people drown in crowds, 20 feet from other swimmers, with dozens of people watching and no one moving. A drowning person, in the final stage that specialists call the instinctive drowning response, cannot call for help. Speech is a function the body sacrifices, because the respiratory system's entire priority has become breathing. And a person fighting to get a breath cannot also spend that breath shouting. They cannot wave for help either, because the arms instinctively press down on the surface of the water, trying to lever the mouth up into the air. They do not thrash. They are usually upright, low in the water, mouth at the surface, head tilted back, working silently and with total concentration to keep breathing. And this lasts only 20 to 60 seconds before they slip under. No splash, no scream, no drama. A person can be drowning within arm's reach of family and lifeguards, and no one recognizes it, because it looks like someone quietly bobbing in the water. And by the time it is obvious, the 20 to 60 seconds are gone. And underneath all of it, accelerating everything, is panic, which is not just an emotion here, but a physical process that shortens the time a person has. The moment someone realizes they are being carried out and cannot get back, the body floods with adrenaline, the heart rate climbs, and the breathing goes fast and shallow. Every one of those responses burns oxygen faster and makes the situation worse. Fast, shallow, panicked breathing means less air taken in per breath at exactly the moment the body needs more. The thrashing effort of fighting the current burns through the muscles' reserves in minutes, and the instinct to keep the head high and lunge for air drives the exhausting, doomed vertical struggle instead of the calm, efficient float that would keep the mouth clear with almost no effort. This is why the single most important survival skill in the water is not strength and not speed. It is the ability to not panic, to override the animal terror and stay calm enough to float, to breathe slowly, to think. A calm person in a rip current can stay alive almost indefinitely, floating on their back, riding it out, waiting. A panicking person of identical fitness can be dead in a couple of minutes, not because the water did anything different to them, but because the panic spent their oxygen and their strength before the current ever had to. The cruelty is that panic is the natural response and calm is the trained one. And the people who most need the trained response are the ones who have never been in water that would have taught it to them. Now combine those two facts and you have built the exact trap that empties families into the Gulf. The first victim, a child, usually, or a weaker swimmer, is carried out by a current no one saw and begins to drown silently, in a way that does not announce itself. Someone finally notices, and it is almost always someone who loves them, and that person goes in. But here is the thing the rescuer does not know. The drowning victim they are swimming toward is not a passive body to be towed. A drowning person in the grip of that instinctive response is a survival machine with one program running: get the mouth to the air. And to a person in that state, another human body in the water is not a rescuer. It is a flotation device. They will climb it. They will grab whoever reaches them and push down, using the rescuer's body to lever themselves up. And in doing so, they push the rescuer under. This is why trained lifeguards approach a panicking victim with a float held out in front of them and are taught, if grabbed, to release and go under, because a drowning person will drown the person trying to save them without any malice at all, purely as reflex. The untrained rescuer, the father, the brother, the good stranger, does not know this. They swim straight in, get grabbed, get climbed, and now there are two people drowning where there was one, both of them in the same current, and the beach is still 50 yards away. So what actually works? What is the thing the pool never teaches and the brochure never mentions? It is almost insultingly simple, and it is the opposite of every instinct. Do not fight the current. Do not swim toward shore. The rip is narrow. It is a jet, not a wide field of water, and it is only pushing you in one direction, straight out. If you stop fighting it and instead swim parallel to the beach, sideways, you will in a short distance swim out of the narrow band of current and into water that is no longer pulling you anywhere, and from there you can angle back to shore on your own terms. And if you are too tired even to do that, the answer is more radical still. Stop swimming entirely. Flip onto your back, float, keep your head above water, and let the current carry you out until it weakens and dissipates, which it always does because a rip current does not run forever. It fires out through the surf zone and fans out and dies a little way offshore. Float, don't fight. Conserve everything. Signal for help if you can, and let the current spend itself. Flip, float, and follow the safe way back. It is taught on every safety sign on the coast, and it saves the people who happen to have read it. And it is completely unnatural, which is why so few people do it when the moment comes and the shore is right there and every cell in the body is screaming to swim for it. The defense against this coast is not strength and it is not courage. It is a piece of counterintuitive knowledge that has to be in your head before you ever get in the water, which is why the only reliable defense is the one thing a pool and a lake never teach: how to read the water and yourself before you are in trouble. You can even learn to spot it if someone teaches you. A rip current leaves signatures on the surface for anyone who knows the vocabulary. A narrow lane of water that is a slightly different color than the water on either side, often darker because it is deeper where the current has scoured a channel, or murkier because it is dragging churned-up sand out to sea. A gap in the line of breaking waves, a stretch where the whitewater simply stops because the outbound current is flattening the incoming waves in that lane. A ribbon of foam or seaweed or debris, moving steadily away from the beach while everything around it moves toward shore. Choppy, rippled water in a channel flanked by calmer water. These are not subtle once you know them, but they are completely invisible to someone who has never been told they exist. And that is the entire tragedy of this coast in a single observation. The danger writes its own warning on the surface of the water, in a language almost none of the people in the water can read. And it is not even a fixed language, which is the part that makes a single glance so worthless. The water does not decide once a day whether it is safe. It changes hour to hour, because the things that drive the rips change hour to hour. The tide rises and falls, and the strength and location of a rip shift with it. Many rips run hardest around lower tide, when the water over the sandbars is shallowest and the drainage back out is most forced. So a channel that was harmless at 10 in the morning can be firing hard by early afternoon. The swell shifts, a little more energy arriving from a slightly different direction, and the whole balance of water pumping over the bar and draining out through the gaps reorganizes itself. The wind changes. A spot where there was no current at all can develop one over the course of a couple of hours, and a spot that was dangerous can go quiet. And nothing about the surface will announce the change to someone who is not watching continuously. This is exactly why reading the water was a job and not a glance. The watermen were not checking a box once and trusting it all day. They were reading the water the way you read traffic while driving, constantly updating, never assuming that because it was safe a minute ago, it is safe now. A family that looks at the Gulf at noon, decides it is fine, and stops looking is making a judgment about a system that will not hold still, and the water they walk back into at 3 o'clock, confident, because it was fine at noon, may be a completely different piece of ocean, which raises the obvious question, who ever could read it? Because somebody clearly did. Long before there was a single lifeguard stand or a colored flag on a pole, people lived and worked along this coast, and they did not drown at the rate the tourists do now. They read the water for a living, and it is worth understanding exactly what that means because it is the opposite of the way we treat the ocean today. For the communities scattered along the northern Gulf before there were paved roads and bridges connecting them, the water was not recreation. The water was the road. If you needed to move people, timber, fish, mail, or supplies between the little settlements strung along St. Andrew Bay and the Barrier Coast, you moved them by boat, because overland through the pine flats and swamp was slow, and sometimes impossible. That meant a working knowledge of the water was not a hobby or a folk tradition. It was survival economics, learned young and refined over a lifetime. You learned which color of water meant a shoal you would run aground on, and which meant a channel deep enough to pass. You learned that a gap in the breakers was not an invitation, but a drain. You learned to read the choppy foam streaks that marked moving water, and the most important thing you learned, the thing that separated the old watermen from the tourists who die here now, was restraint. Reading the water was not about knowing when you could beat it. It was about knowing when to stay out of it. The skill was not courage. The skill was the discipline to look at water that other people thought was fine and say, not today, and go home. It is worth being concrete about what that knowledge actually contained because it was not vague sea sense or superstition. It was a detailed, practical, tested body of information about a specific stretch of water, held in the heads of people who could not afford to be wrong. Around St. Andrew Bay and the Barrier Coast. Before the road came through, the settlements were effectively islands connected only by water. If you lived there, you moved by boat, or you did not move much at all. And everything that mattered, the fish you sold, the timber you shipped, the supplies you brought home, the mail, the trip to see a doctor, went across the water. That meant a person read the surface of the Gulf and the bay the way a farmer reads soil and sky, constantly and for keeps. You learned that a particular shade of pale green over a spot meant a shoal shallow enough to tear the bottom out of a boat, and a darker band meant a channel you could run. You learned which passes could be crossed at which state of the tide, and which turned into a churning mess of breaking water when the tide and the wind opposed each other. You learned to watch the line of breakers along the bars for the gap where the water was flat, and you learned, this is the part the tourists never inherited, that the flat gap was not a door, but a drain, the visible sign of water pouring back out to sea. You learned the weather from the feel of the air and the behavior of the swell hours before it arrived, because there was no radio to tell you and no harbor close enough to run to if you guessed wrong. And all of that knowledge pointed, in the end, at a single habit, staying out of trouble rather than getting out of it. The working watermen of this coast did not prize the bold crossing or the run made in bad water. They prized the trip not taken, the load left on the dock until tomorrow, the read of the sky that said, wait. Their whole expertise bent toward restraint because they understood, in a way that a person raised on pools and lakes simply cannot, that this water gives no second chances to the person who overestimates himself, and that the way you die out here is not usually by being unlucky in a storm, but by being confident on a day that looked fine. That is the knowledge that has almost entirely vanished from these beaches now, replaced by nothing, and its absence is the empty space into which the tourists walk. It is also the exact knowledge one man made his name by throwing away. That discipline is exactly what one man built a reputation on refusing, and it made him, for a while, one of the most trusted figures on the coast, right up until the coast collected. His name was Willis Green Barrow, and in the summer of 1937 he was the captain of the steamship Tarpon. And if you had asked anyone along the northern Gulf who knew the water, they would have told you Barrow did. He was 34 years into the job. 34 years running the same essential route, Mobile, Alabama, down and around to Pensacola, and on to St. Andrew Bay, the run that served Panama City before the roads did. By the accounting that survives, the Tarpon under Barrow had made that voyage roughly 1,735 times. Think about what that number does to a man's judgment. 1,735 times he had looked at the Gulf, made a call, and been right because he came home. The route was the coast's lifeline. It carried the freight and the passengers that the isolated bay communities depended on. And Barrow carried it on schedule, in good weather and bad, with a confidence that hardened over the decades into something like a creed. The line attributed to him, the one that survived him, was blunt. God makes the weather, and I make the trip. That was the whole philosophy. The weather was not his department. Getting there was. You can see already the exact inversion of the old waterman's discipline. Their skill was restraint. His pride was the refusal of it. And for 34 years the Gulf let him get away with it, which is the cruelest thing a dangerous place can do to a confident man. Reward him over and over until the reward feels like a law of nature. On the last day of August 1937, the Tarpon loaded at Mobile and Pensacola for the run to Panama City. She was, by the accounts that came out afterward, heavily loaded, carrying something on the order of 200 tons of cargo, freight for the bay communities, stacked and stowed for a routine overnight passage. The objective was simple, and it was the only objective Barrow had ever really served. Keep the schedule, deliver the freight, make the trip. The forecast was calm. The evening was calm. She cleared Pensacola and stood out into the Gulf on a course for St. Andrew Bay, an old ship on an old route under a captain who had done this exact thing more times than almost any mariner alive. And for the first hours, there was no reason on the water to think this night was different from 1,700 others. The first warning came in the dark, in the small hours. Around 2 in the morning, the sea began to rise. Not a hurricane, not a named storm bearing down. Just the Gulf getting up, the way it can. A building sea and freshening wind working on a heavily laden old ship in the middle of the night. And this is where the physics of an overloaded vessel turns a rough night into a mortal one. A ship riding low under 200 tons of cargo does not lift to a sea the way a light ship does. The waves that a well-found, properly loaded vessel would ride over began instead to work at her, to come aboard, to find the water's way into her. Water is heavy, and it does not stay where it lands. It runs to the low point and it sloshes, and every ton of it that gets inside a hull makes the ship ride lower and roll worse, which lets the next wave aboard more easily. That is the loop that sinks ships in weather that would not by itself seem deadly. Not one giant wave. A slow accumulation. An old ship settling degree by degree while her crew fights to keep ahead of it. The pressure on the decision was everything Barrow had ever been. The reputation built on 1,700 trips. The cargo. Somebody's freight. The route's whole purpose. The schedule that was, to him, the point of the entire enterprise. Against all of that stood a simple, humble option that the old waterman would have taken without a second thought. Get out of it. And according to the record that came out of the investigation afterward, the crew saw it too. As the ship labored, the men moved to run her toward the beach, to deliberately put her aground in the shallows, where a settled ship is a survivable ship, and the people aboard can wade or be pulled ashore. Beaching her would have cost the cargo, and bruised the schedule, and dented the legend. It would very likely have saved the lives. And Barrow ordered them back on course, back on the route, back to the trip he had promised the weather would never stop him from making. That was the option lost, the door that closed and did not reopen. The moment the ship stopped running for the beach and turned her stern back to the rising sea, they tried to regain control the only other way left to them. If the ship was riding too low, lighten her. So they began to jettison the cargo, to throw the freight over the side and let the ship rise on her lines and answer the sea again. It is exactly the right instinct, and it is what any competent crew would do. But the second complication changed what that response meant. It didn't work. Dumping the cargo did not right her. She had taken on too much water, or the sea had gotten too far ahead, and the lightning that should have bought them buoyancy bought them nothing they could feel. Now the meaning of the night had changed completely. The objective was no longer the schedule, or the cargo, or the reputation. The objective was to live, and the tools for that objective were almost gone. The point of no return arrived in the worst possible order. Before the crew could get the boats away and the men off in any organized fashion, the tarpon settled by the stern, her back end going down first, the bow lifting, the ship sliding under at an angle that gave the people aboard almost no margin. Abandoned ship, the one procedure that might have saved everyone, came too late to be orderly, because the ship went before the plan could. Men went into a rising gulf in the dark, some in the water with whatever would float, the ship gone out from under them. And then the consequence, which is precise and which is grim. 18 people died, and Captain Willis Green Barrow was one of them, the man whose creed was that the weather could not stop the trip, stopped, finally and permanently, by the weather. The rescue that followed is its own lesson, and it did not arrive like magic. A Coast Guard aircraft and 2 Coast Guard cutters worked the area where the ship had gone down, and between them, they pulled 11 people alive out of the water. Rescue at sea is never instant. It is a signal received, an asset dispatched, a search across moving water for small heads in a big sea, and an approach and a haul-out that is dangerous in its own right. And in this case, it recovered 11 and could not reach the rest in time. One survival stands apart from all the others and tells you what the Gulf here actually demands of a body. An oiler named Adley Baker, a man from the engine spaces, went into the water and did not get picked up, and swam. By the account that survives, he was in the Gulf for something on the order of 25 hours, swimming and staying afloat through a day and a night. And he came ashore alive on the beach west of Panama City, having crossed on his own power a stretch of open Gulf that would be the featured horror of most other disaster stories, and was here one man's survival. It is worth stopping on exactly why the tarpon could not be saved once the sea got up, because the physics of it is the same lesson the coast teaches over and over, only written in steel and cargo instead of sand and current. A ship floats because the water it pushes aside weighs more than the ship does, and a ship stays upright because of a balance between where its weight sits and how the hull sits in the water. Lean it a little, and the shape of the submerged hull pushes it back upright. That righting ability is not infinite, and 2 things the tarpon had going against her that night ate straight into it. The first was simple overloading. 200 tons of cargo rides a ship low, and a ship riding low has little freeboard, little height of hull between the waterline and the deck. The less freeboard you have, the smaller the wave it takes to come aboard, and every wave that comes aboard is more weight added high in the ship, exactly where added weight does the most harm. The second thing was worse, and it has a name that every mariner learns to fear: the free surface effect. Water that has gotten inside a hull does not sit still. It runs downhill to whatever side the ship is leaning toward, and its weight, arriving on the low side, pushes the ship to lean further, which sends the water further still. A loose body of water inside a ship is not just dead weight. It is dead weight that actively moves to make every roll worse, feeding the very motion that is trying to capsize her. A ship can be perfectly stable with solid cargo and become dangerously unstable the moment a few feet of water is sloshing across a deck below, because that moving water attacks the righting balance directly. So when the tarpon began taking water in a rising sea, she was not simply getting heavier. She was getting less and less able to right herself with every ton that came aboard. And the sea, sensing the growing sluggishness, put more water aboard more easily. That is the loop, and it is a loop that tightens on its own once it starts. This is why the crew's instinct to run her onto the beach was exactly right, and why losing that option was fatal. A ship deliberately grounded in shallow water is a ship that cannot capsize and cannot sink out from under her people. She sits on the bottom, battered but stable, and the crew and passengers can be taken off or can wade off, or can wait for help on a hull that is going nowhere. Beaching trades the cargo and the schedule for the lives, and it is the seaman-like answer to exactly the situation the tarpon was in. When Barrow ordered the crew off that plan and back onto the route, he was not choosing between a good outcome and a bad one. He was trading away the one move that reliably saves everyone for the hope that the ship could ride it out. And once she had taken enough water, jettisoning the cargo could not undo it, because the problem was no longer the weight of the freight. The problem was the water already inside her and the free surface it created, and you cannot throw that overboard by opening a cargo hatch. By the time the cargo was going over the side, the decision that mattered had already been made hours earlier when she turned her stern back to the sea. The rescue that followed is a reminder that at sea, in that era especially, help did not come quickly and did not come to everyone. When a ship goes down offshore in the dark, the first problem is that no one ashore necessarily knows it yet, and the second is that the people in the water are scattered small, dark specks across a large and moving stretch of sea. The Coast Guard response that came together brought an aircraft and 2 cutters to work the area where the tarpon had gone down, a plane to search from above, where a spotter can see a wider patch of water and pick out debris and swimmers that a ship at sea level never could, and the cutters to do the actual pulling of people from the water. Between them, they recovered 11 people alive. 11 out of a ship's company that the records cannot even agree on the size of. The rest were beyond reach, not because the rescuers failed, but because the anatomy of a sea rescue has hard limits. The time it takes to learn a ship is gone, the time to reach the position, the time to search moving water, and the brutal fact that a person in the open sea has only so long before exhaustion and exposure finish what the sinking started. Some of the tarpon's people were pulled from the water and lived. Some were not reached in time. That is the honest shape of most rescues, and it is a long way from the version where help arrives at the last second and everyone is saved. Which is what makes Adley Baker's survival so staggering that it deserves to be understood, not just stated. Baker was an oiler, an engine room man, and when the ship went, he ended up in the Gulf and was not among the 11 the cutters found. He was in the water, by the account that survives, for something on the order of 25 hours, a full day and a night and part of another day. And in that time, he covered what amounts to roughly 9 miles of open Gulf and came ashore on his own power, alive, on the beach west of Panama City. Consider what that actually requires of a body. In early September, the Gulf here is warm, bathwater warm, so Baker was not fighting the fast killer of cold water that takes swimmers in northern seas in an hour. His enemies were slower and just as total, the simple, grinding exhaustion of keeping a body afloat and moving for 25 straight hours. Thirst, because a person surrounded by seawater has nothing to drink. The mental toll of a day and a night alone in open water with no land in sight and no way to know if he was making progress or being carried in circles. Most people would have given out, not from any single dramatic failure, but from the accumulation, the hours stacking up until the will and the muscles both quit. Baker did not. He swam and floated and stayed alive across 9 miles of the same gulf that, 80 and 90 years later, kills fit adults 50 yards from the sand, and he walked out of it. And what he did, almost certainly without knowing the theory of it, was the very thing the safety signs now beg people to do. He did not exhaust himself fighting for an impossible immediate shore. He endured. He let the time pass and kept his head above water and did not panic himself to death. And the water, eventually, let him go. The difference between Baker and the men who die at 50 yards is not fitness, and it is not the water. It is that Baker, by necessity, understood he could not win in the first 10 minutes, and the men at 50 yards believe they can and burn themselves out proving they cannot. How and why the tarpon came to that, the loading, the course, the call on the bridge, now belong to the investigators. The official reckoning came from the Bureau of Marine Investigation and Navigation, the federal body that examined shipwrecks in that era, and its conclusion pointed at the captain, at the decisions on the bridge, the loading, the choice to hold course into a rising sea when the beach was there to take. That is the verdict on paper. It is worth being honest, though, about what the record does and does not settle, because this is old, and the sources do not fully agree, and pretending they do would be exactly the kind of false certainty this coast punishes. The death toll is usually given as 18, but some accounts put it higher, at 24. The number of people aboard is uncertain in the same way. Some say 25 souls, some say 31. The exact roster of who was on that ship and who came off it alive did not survive into perfect agreement. And the responsible thing is to say so plainly. The tarpon killed either 18 or 24 people out of either 25 or 31 on a calm forecast, on a calm quarten, and the disagreement in the numbers is itself part of what the era's record can and cannot tell us. But strip away the uncertainty in the counts, and the core lesson stands, and it is the thing that makes the tarpon the right place to begin. This coast did not kill the tarpon with visible violence. There was no monster storm on the charts, no hurricane bearing a name that everyone fled. There was a calm forecast, a routine night, a confident captain, and a gulf that got up quietly in the dark and took an old, overloaded ship apart degree by degree. The Panhandle's signature, the thing it has been doing since long before anyone thought to measure it, is right there in 1937. It does not kill you when the water looks dangerous. It kills you when the water and the forecast and every instinct you own all say calm. Now sit with the reversal, because it is the hinge the whole rest of this story swings on. Adley Baker, in 1937, survived something on the order of 9 miles of open gulf. A man from the engine room, no special training in survival swimming, went into a rising sea in the dark and stayed alive in the water for a day and a night and walked out. And today, on the same coast, in water so shallow and so calm that Baker would not have recognized it as the same ocean, fit adults, strong men, athletes, fathers in the prime of their lives, die 50 yards from dry sand, in water they could have stood up in a few steps back. 9 miles then. 50 yards now. That is not a story about the water getting more dangerous. The Gulf did not change. The physics of the sand and the bars and the rip currents in 1937 were exactly the physics of today. What changed was not the water. What changed was who is in it, and what they know, and what they have been sold. Because the exposure that fills those 50 yards with victims did not happen by accident. It was manufactured deliberately and sold as a product, and the marketing was not even dishonest. That is what makes it so effective. After the Second World War, as America built highways and bought cars and discovered the paid vacation, the Panhandle had exactly one thing to sell, and it was the thing that had shaped it, that impossibly white sand and that warm, clear, shallow, gentle-looking water, and so it sold it. The coast reinvented itself as a vacation destination for the interior South, and the pitch wrote itself. Come to the water that is warm when the ocean up north is cold. Come to the water so clear you can see your feet. Come to the water so shallow and so calm your children can play in it. Millions of people a year began making the drive. Down from Alabama, over from Georgia, out of Tennessee, the landlocked middle of the country, pointing its station wagons and later its minivans at the one coast that looked like it had been built for people who could not really swim. The scale of that migration is the thing you have to hold on to, because the danger is a numbers game and the numbers are enormous. Panama City Beach and the surrounding Panhandle draw millions of visitors a year, and they are not, for the most part, the fly-in international travelers of Miami or the coastal locals of California. They are drive-to families and college students from the interior South, so overwhelmingly so that the coast picked up a nickname, the Redneck Riviera, a half-affectionate label that is really a demographic fact. This is the beach for people who do not otherwise have a beach. They come from Birmingham and Atlanta and Nashville and the small towns in between, from states where the nearest natural body of water you swim in is a lake, a reservoir, a river, or a backyard pool. And they come in the hundreds of thousands during the peak weeks, packing the 27 miles of sand with bodies during spring break and the summer holidays, the exact weeks when the crowds are densest and the guarding is stretched thinnest across the most people. Now put that population next to the water they are entering, and the mismatch is total. Surf literacy. The ability to look at moving ocean water and read it, to feel a current and respond correctly, to know in your body that you do not swim straight for shore, is not something you are born with, and it is not something you can acquire in a week. It is built the way the old watermen built it, through years of exposure to water that behaves like the ocean behaves, through being in it often enough that the responses become instinct. A person who has spent their whole life swimming in still water has instincts, strong ones, and every one of them is calibrated for water that does not move underneath you. Drop that person into a surf zone with an invisible current, and their instincts do not just fail to help. They actively push them toward the fatal choice, because the instinct that says tired or scared, head straight back to where you started, is exactly the instinct that kills in a rip. The vacation does not have time to rewrite that. A family here for 6 days does not become surf literate on day 2. They spend all 6 days operating on still water instincts in moving water. And for the overwhelming majority, nothing happens. And they go home, having confirmed to themselves that the water was as safe as it looked, which sends them back next year and their friends after them, more confident than ever, into the same trap. And that is the fault line, right there. And it is worth being precise about, because it is the mechanism that turns a beautiful beach into the deadliest one in the country. Go back and read the promise the coast makes to these visitors, and notice something unsettling. Every word of it is true, and every true word is also a way to drown. The water is warm, true, and warmth is why people stay in it for hours, long past the point where a colder sea would have chased them out before any current found them. It is clear, true, and clarity is why the bottom looks so reassuringly close that a swimmer keeps wading farther out, not understanding that you can see straight through water that is trying to carry you away. It is shallow far out. True, and the shallowness is why a family walks 100 feet from the sand still feeling safe and ends up standing right at the sandbar, right beside the gap where the rip fires. It is calm. True. And calm is the single most dangerous face this water ever wears, because calm is exactly how it looks on the days the current runs hardest. The marketing never lied. It described the trap in precise detail and called it paradise. And it delivered, in enormous numbers, the people least prepared to survive the one thing it never had to mention, because everything it did say was the truth. So the danger stopped being about the water and started being about the water plus the people. And once you understand that combination, you understand why the defining event of this coast in the modern era is not a shipwreck at all. It is a scene that plays out in some form on a hot afternoon with a light flag flying and no lifeguard in sight. And it plays out again and again at a very particular kind of place. It happens at the piers, and the pier is not a coincidence. It is a cause. Everything that makes a rip current dangerous, a pier concentrates and makes permanent. Remember the mechanism. Water pumped over the sandbars piles up in the trough and has to drain back out, running sideways until it finds a gap. A pier is a wall of pilings marching straight out from the beach across that entire drainage path, and it does two things to the water. First, the pilings obstruct the sideways flow and force the trapped water to run along the structure and out to sea beside it, channeling the drainage into a strong, reliable jet right next to the pier. Second, that constant flow of water scours the sand away from around the pilings, digging a deep permanent trench along the pier that the current then uses as its highway out. The result is that a pier does not get the wandering, here today, gone tomorrow flash rips that form and dissolve along an open beach. A pier gets a fixed rip, a current that is there, in the same place, on almost every tide, strong and predictable and permanent, anchored to the structure. If you wanted to design a machine for manufacturing a dangerous current in one exact spot and keeping it there forever, you would build a pier. And then, having built the perfect permanent rip, you surround it with people, because a pier is also the single most attractive spot on the beach. It is a landmark you can see from a mile away and swim toward. It offers shade under and beside it. People fish from it, and swimmers gather near it to look up at the fishing lines and the structure. Worse, the water right beside a pier often looks calmer than the open beach, because the pilings dampen the incoming waves in their lee. So the water next to the pier reads, to an untrained eye, as the safest water on the beach, when it is, in fact, sitting right beside the strongest and most permanent current on the beach, maximum people drawn to maximum danger by an illusion of calm that is created by the very structure generating the current. That is why so many of the worst incidents on this coast happen within sight of a pier. And it is why the scene that finally shows you what this beach really is unfolded at 1. On the 8th of July, 2017, at the M.B. Miller County Pier on Panama City Beach, the flag flying was yellow. Medium hazard, moderate surf or currents, swim with caution. Not a red flag, not a closure. A yellow flag on an ordinary summer afternoon. Families in the water up and down the beach, and among them, the family of a woman named Roberta Ursry. Her 2 sons, boys of 8 and 11, were in the water, and they drifted. That is how it starts, always. Not a dramatic plunge, but a drift, the boys moving out and along without realizing it. Carried by a current they could not feel, and would not have had a name for, until they were too far out to simply walk back, and the water where they were was well over their heads. Ursry saw them in trouble, and did what every human being who has ever loved a child does without a moment's calculation. She went in after them. So did other members of the family. And one by one, the rescuers became victims. because none of them knew the one thing that would have saved them. That you do not fight the current, you let it carry you and you swim across it. And so they swam straight at their drowning children, straight into the jet, and the current took them too. Within minutes, there were 9 people trapped in the water, in something like 15 feet of it. Too far out to stand, too exhausted and too frightened to make progress against a current, none of them understood, and no lifeguard on that stretch of beach to help them. The rescue system on the deadliest beach in America, in that moment, was whoever happened to be standing on the sand. And here is where the same instinct that was killing the Ursary family, the instinct to go in after people in trouble, turned barely into the thing that saved them, because of a few people who did know better and a crowd willing to be organized. A woman named Jessica Simmons, who was on the beach and could actually swim, grabbed a boogie board and paddled out toward the trapped family. But 9 people cannot be pulled in one at a time by one swimmer on a boogie board. Not against that current. Not before some of them go under. So the people on the beach did something that should be taught in every school on the Gulf Coast. They formed a human chain. Strangers. Dozens of them. People who had never met the Ursaries or each other waded into the water and joined hands. And then more people joined onto them, and more, extending the chain out from the beach, hand over hand into the surf. The people who could not swim held the shallow end, anchored on their feet in water they could stand in, and the chain reached out across the water, person by person, until it was long enough, by the accounts of that day. Something like 80 people stretched across roughly 100 yards of gulf to reach the drowning family and pass them back down the line, hand to hand, from the deep water to the sand. Sit with what that chain actually was, because it tells you something about this coast that no statistic quite captures. 80 ordinary people on vacation, most of whom could not have told you what a rip current was an hour earlier, improvised, in real time, with no training and no equipment, but a boogie board and their own linked hands. The single most effective mass water rescue that stretch of beach had that day. And they did it because there was no one else. There was no lifeguard on that part of the beach. There was no boat standing by, no trained crew, no rescue swimmer. The entire rescue apparatus available to 9 drowning people that afternoon was the crowd. And the crowd, to its enormous credit, rose to it. But think about what it means that the crowd had to. It means that on the deadliest beach in America, the primary rescue system, the thing that actually stands between a swimmer in trouble and death, is other swimmers who happen to be nearby. Not professionals, bystanders. And a rescue system made of bystanders is a system that works when the beach is crowded and the weather is warm and someone happens to be both willing and able, and fails silently and completely every time those conditions don't all line up at once. This is the inversion at the heart of the whole story, and it runs directly back to the watermen. There was a time when almost everyone on this coast could read the water, because reading the water was the price of living here. It was how you fished, how you traveled, how you survived. The knowledge was ambient, held by the whole community, passed down as a matter of course. Then the roads and the bridges came, and the working coast became a vacation coast, and the population that fills these beaches in the summer inverted completely. Now, the overwhelming majority of the people in the water on any given day are visitors from hundreds of miles inland, and the ambient knowledge that used to belong to everyone belongs, functionally, to almost no one. The water is exactly as dangerous as it ever was. The literacy that used to keep people out of trouble is gone. And the thing that was supposed to replace it, professional lifeguarding, covers a fraction of the coast so small that for most swimmers on most beaches, it might as well not exist. Run the geography honestly, and the scale of the gap is almost absurd. The Panhandle offers something on the order of 200 miles of this sugar-white, rip-prone shore. Panama City Beach alone stretches about 27 miles. And the guarded lifeguard locations. Stands with trained professionals watching the water and ready to go in. Number 3. 3. A lifeguard, however skilled, however alert, can only watch and reach a limited arc of water. A guarded stand effectively protects the stretch within sight and fast swimming distance of it, a few hundred yards to either side at best. 3 such points along 27 miles means that the guarded water is a handful of short ribbons separated by miles of beach where the rescue plan, whether anyone says so out loud or not, is the same one that saved the Ursary family. Hope that somebody nearby notices, and hope that somebody nearby can swim, and hope that there are enough of them to make a chain. A family that spreads its towel a mile down the beach from a guarded stand is not a little bit less protected than a family in front of one. They are, for all practical purposes, on their own. And it is fair to ask why. Why a coast that knows it is killing people does not simply post guards along its length. Because the answer is not indifference, it is arithmetic, and the arithmetic is brutal. Lifeguarding 200 miles of shoreline to a real standard would mean hundreds of trained professionals, towers, equipment, vehicles, and the year-round organization to recruit and train and pay them, spread across the enormous linear distance of the coast and concentrated into the few months when the crowds actually come. Unlike a compact city beach where a few stands can cover the whole swimmable front, this coast is a thin line hundreds of miles long, and the crowds are diffuse, scattered along every access point and every stretch of public sand. You cannot guard a line that long the way you guard a box. The cost of doing it properly is enormous, and the season is short, and so the guarding that exists is concentrated at a few high-traffic points, and the rest of the coast is covered by flags, by signs, and by the hope that people will read them. Which brings the whole problem back to the one thing that fails first. People do not read the water, because they were never taught how, because they come from places where the water does not need to be read. So the default rescuer on this coast is not a lifeguard. It is whoever is standing closest when someone starts to drown, and that person, in the overwhelming majority of cases, is family. It is the parent, the sibling, the friend, the one who loves the victim most and knows the least about the current. And everything about the physiology of drowning and the mechanics of a rip is designed, as if on purpose, to kill exactly that person. The untrained rescuer who swims straight at a panicking victim gets climbed, gets pushed under, and joins them in the same current. The coast has, in effect, engineered a situation where its primary rescue system is composed of the single category of people most likely to become its next victims. And there is a way to break that pattern, a piece of knowledge as counterintuitive and as life-saving as the flip and float itself, and it deserves to be said plainly because it runs against every instinct a person has when someone they love is drowning. If you see someone caught in a current, the worst thing you can do, the thing that turns one victim into two, is the thing you will most want to do, which is to swim out to them. Do not. The rule that lifeguards live by is reach or throw, but don't go. Send help, get a lifeguard, call for emergency services, make noise so others come. Throw the victim something that floats, a boogie board, a cooler lid, an inflatable, a ball, anything that will keep them up. Because a drowning person who gets afloat can stop fighting and stay alive long enough to be reached, and shout to them the one instruction that might save them on its own. Stop swimming, flip onto your back, and float. A person in a rip who can be talked into floating instead of fighting has bought themselves the minutes it takes for the current to weaken or for real help to arrive. If you absolutely must enter the water, never go empty-handed and never let them grab you. Bring the float and push it out ahead of you. Keep it between you and them, because a panicking victim will climb anything within reach, and the thing they climb goes under. This is exactly what the crowd on July 8th got right without being trained to. The non-swimmers anchored in the shallows, the boogie board sent out ahead, the chain reaching rather than a line of lone swimmers charging into the current. They rescued 9 people and lost none of the rescuers precisely because by instinct or by luck, they did not do the thing that kills. They did not send single untethered bodies swimming into the jet. The chain on July 8th worked. It was a genuine, improvised triumph of 80 strangers. But it was a safety net woven in the one crucial moment, entirely out of people who simply happened to be standing there. And a net like that catches you only when the beach is full and the luck holds. Everyone came out of the water alive. That is the headline. And it is true. And it is exactly why the story should keep you up at night rather than reassure you. Because the cost was not zero, and the margin was luck. Roberta Ursry's mother, who had gone into the water like everyone else in that family, suffered a massive heart attack in the ordeal. The physical toll of the panic and the exertion and the fight. And she had to be revived in the ambulance, brought back from the edge on the way to the hospital. A nephew broke a hand. And the thing that should chill you is the arithmetic underneath the happy ending. Every single ingredient of a mass casualty drowning was present that afternoon. 9 people in the water at once, no lifeguard, a current strong enough to hold all of them. A rescue improvised on the spot by strangers with a boogie board and their own bodies. Change one variable. A colder day, so fewer people are on the beach to form the chain, a slightly stronger current. 10 more minutes before someone competent notices. And the story of July 8, 2017 is the story of a family that lost 4 or 5 people in front of a crowd that could not reach them in time. Nobody died. But nobody died because the beach got lucky, not because the beach was safe, and a safety system that runs on luck and the kindness of 80 strangers is not a safety system. It is the absence of one, dressed up as a miracle, which is precisely the point that the summer of 2023 drove home, without the miracle. Because in June of that year, the luck ran out, over and over, in the space of 9 days, and it turned Panama City Beach, by the National Weather Service's own accounting of rip current fatalities, into the deadliest beach in the United States for the year. 7 people drowned in rip currents at Panama City Beach in that stretch. 7 in 9 days on one beach. To feel how extreme that is, you have to know what rip currents do across the whole country in a normal year, because the number is already startling before you concentrate it into one beach and 9 days. By the accounting of the National Weather Service and the life-saving organizations that track this, rip currents are the leading surf zone killer in the United States. They drown, in an ordinary year, on the order of 100 people spread across every guarded and unguarded beach in the nation, more than the beachgoers killed by sharks and lightning combined. A quiet, steady toll that almost never makes national news because it happens 1 or 2 at a time, scattered across thousands of miles of coast and a whole summer. That is the baseline. 100 or so deaths, nationwide, over months, across every coast the country has. And then you look at Panama City Beach in June of 2023 and you see 7 of them stacked onto a single stretch of Florida sand inside 9 days. A meaningful fraction of the entire nation's annual rip current death toll, concentrated onto one beach in a week and a half. That is not a beach having a bad run of luck. That is a beach whose specific geography manufactures the deadliest surf zone conditions in the country, and then fills them with the people least equipped to survive them. And the National Weather Service's numbers simply confirmed what the physics had been guaranteeing all along. And the detail inside that number is the one that finally names the killer correctly. On a single day, the 24th of June, 3 men drowned. A 39-year-old and a 63-year-old, both from Georgia, and a 68-year-old from Michigan, and they drowned under double red flags. 2 red flags. On this coast, double red does not mean caution, and it does not mean swim at your own risk. It means the water is closed. It is against the rules to be in it. The most serious warning the system has was flying, and 3 men went into the Gulf and did not come out. Bay County Sheriff Tommy Ford said the thing out loud that the numbers had been circling for the better part of a century, and he said it in a public statement on the sheriff's office Facebook page after watching the pattern repeat in front of his deputies. The people dying here, he pointed out, were so often not careless swimmers who underestimated the surf. They were people who went into the water to save someone else. Strangers, parents, good people who saw a child or a friend or a total unknown struggling and did the human thing. And he had watched it kill them, including, he noted, more than one father who died trying to save his own children on Father's Day. Stay on that detail because it is not a coincidence and it is not sentiment. It is the mechanism showing its face. Look at who lives and who dies in these family drownings, and a brutal pattern emerges. The person who first gets into trouble is very often a child or a weaker swimmer, and that person, surprisingly often, is the one who survives, pulled out, or kept afloat by someone, or carried by the current into water shallow enough to stand. The people who die are the rescuers. They are the fathers, the strong swimmers, the fit adults, the ones with the confidence and the physical ability to go in after a struggling child. And it is precisely that confidence and ability that kills them, because they trust it, and they swim straight and hard at the person they are trying to save, into the throat of a current that no amount of fitness can beat, and they get grabbed and climbed and worn out and pulled under. The current is, in the most horrible sense, a filter that selects for the people willing to sacrifice themselves. It takes the ones who love hardest and act fastest. And Father's Day makes it unbearable, not because of the date, but because the date guarantees the setup. Fathers in the water with their kids, on a warm June afternoon, exactly the people most likely to go in after a child, and most likely to die doing it. Ford was not being poetic. He was describing the demographic the current hunts. That is the sentence that reorganizes the entire story. The fatal mechanism on the deadliest beach in America is not, at its core, the rip current. The rip current is just the trigger. The mechanism is the rescue instinct. The hardwired, admirable, utterly human refusal to stand on the sand and watch someone drown, colliding with a current that specifically punishes the untrained rescuer in a place where the trained rescuer is almost never present. The current picks off the first victim. The love of everyone on the beach for that victim delivers the rest. So close the water. That is the obvious answer. And to their credit, the authorities here have built an entire apparatus to do exactly that. And it is worth looking hard at that apparatus because it is a case study in the limits of control, in everything a modern safety system can do, and the one thing it cannot. There is a flag system standardized and posted, green for low hazard, yellow for medium, a single red for high hazard and dangerous currents, double red for closed. There are National Weather Service rip current forecasts issued daily, rating the risk as low, moderate, or high before anyone even leaves the hotel. There are lifeguards. And in 2023, the year of the 7 deaths, the lifeguards and first responders at Panama City Beach performed something on the order of 237 water rescues. 237 times, someone was pulled out alive who might not have been. That is not a token effort. That is a lot of saved lives. And after the carnage, the local government reached for the strongest tool a government has: the law. In August of 2024, Panama City Beach enacted Ordinance 1650, which made it an actual finable offense to swim during a double red closure, $500 for the first violation, no warning, straight to the fine, and up to $1,000 and the possibility of jail for a second offense. Go in the closed water, get a ticket, or worse. And here is the reversal hiding inside all that machinery. The thing that should make you deeply uneasy about the idea that the problem has been solved. Every piece of that apparatus, the flags, the forecasts, the lifeguards, the ordnance, is a lagging tool. It reacts. The flag goes up after someone reads the conditions. The forecast describes a risk but cannot make anyone believe it. The lifeguard is at one of 3 guarded stands along 27 miles and cannot be everywhere. And the fine, the strongest tool of all, only bites on double red, only on the days the water is legally closed. But go back and look at when people actually die here. The 3 Georgia and Michigan men died on double red, yes? But a great many of the deaths on this coast happen not on double red at all. They happen on a single red flag, high hazard, dangerous, and open. Swim at your own risk. On a single red day, the beach is not closed, the ordinance does not apply. There is no fine. And a family from 400 miles inland, who has driven all night and paid for a week in a beachfront condo, looks at that one red flag, looks at water that appears, because it always appears, calm and clear and shallow and beautiful, and makes a choice. The enforcement tool everyone points to as the solution does not even touch the flag that kills the most people, because the deadliest flag on this coast is not the one that closes the beach. It is the one that leaves the decision to you. That distinction is not abstract, and June of 2024 wrote it in full. It began on a Thursday behind a beachfront bar called Sharky's, with a 19-year-old named Riker Milton, 19 years old, and drowning within sight of dry sand on the same coast where, in another century, a shipwrecked crewman had crossed 9 miles of open gulf and lived. Milton went into the water off Panama City Beach, and the current took him, and he drowned on a Thursday in June, 1 death on 1 afternoon on a long beach. And the very next day, Friday, it happened again. Worse. 3 men from Alabama, who by the accounts of that week had arrived at the beach only hours earlier, who had driven down, checked in, and walked out onto the sand that same day, went into the Gulf and were gone within minutes of entering the water. Not an hour of struggle. Minutes. They went in. The current had them, and it was over that fast. Hold on the timeline of that, because it is the individual scale version of the exact thing that would define this coast's worst hurricane. The danger revealing its true size, long after the moment to react has passed. These were men who had arrived at the beach hours earlier. Think about what that means. They had no time on this water. They had not spent a week watching the flags change and hearing the lifeguards' warnings and absorbing, however slowly, that this gentle-looking gulf was not what it appeared. They had driven down from Alabama, gotten to the sand, looked at the most beautiful, calmest, clearest water they had ever seen, and walked into it. And it gave them minutes. Not enough time to learn anything. Not enough time for a warning to sink in. Not enough time to make a single good decision once the current had them. Because by the time a person in a rip understands what is happening to them, the good options are already gone. The compressed decision window that kills the lone swimmer is measured in seconds, and these men had used up their entire window before they even understood there was one. Whatever local knowledge might have saved them, the read of the water, the flip and float, the swim parallel, none of it can be acquired in the minutes between checking into a condo and wading into the Gulf. And the Gulf does not grant a grace period for newcomers. It ran the same current under the men who had been in town for hours that it ran under everyone else. And the current does not know or care how long you have been on its coast. And the flag flying that Friday was not double red. It was a single red. High hazard, dangerous, open, swim at your own risk. The water was not closed. The ordinance did not apply. No fine would have stopped them, because no fine was on the table. There was only a choice, and a coast that has spent 80 years teaching everyone who visits that the water is safe, and men who had been on that sand for a matter of hours. From a state where you learned to swim in lakes, looking at water that did not look like anything to be afraid of. 5 people died at Panama City Beach in 4 days that June. Milton on Thursday, the 3 men Friday, and the toll did not stop there. And almost none of it happened on the flag that closes the beach. It happened on the flag that lets you choose, which means the single most dangerous thing on the deadliest beach in America is not a current and not a storm. It is the permission to decide for yourself, extended to people who have been told their whole lives, correctly, that this water is the safe kind. To really understand why the single red flag is the deadliest one, you have to understand the moment it is read, because it is never read by a neutral person weighing evidence. It is read by a family at the end of a long, expensive, emotionally loaded journey, and every pressure in that moment pushes the same direction, toward the water. Picture it honestly. They have driven 6 or 8 or 10 hours, often overnight, with kids who have been promised the beach for weeks. They have paid a lot for a few days in a condo with the Gulf out the window. The children have talked about nothing else. They have exactly this many days, and the clock on the vacation is already running. And they walk out onto the sand, and there is a red flag on a pole, and there in front of them is the water. And the water looks, as it almost always looks, calm, clear, shallow, green, and utterly harmless. Now weigh those 2 pieces of information against each other the way a tired, invested, hopeful family actually weighs them. On one side, an abstract warning on a flag, a symbol, a color. On the other side, the direct evidence of their own eyes which are telling them correctly that the water in front of them looks like the safest water they have ever seen. The eyes win. The eyes almost always win, because a human being trusts what they can see over a symbol they have to interpret. And the tragedy is that on this coast, the eyes are wrong in exactly the way the flag is trying to warn them about. This is the perception gap, and it is not a failure of intelligence or of caution. It is a failure built into the situation. A red flag on a coast with big visible surf makes sense to people, because the flag and the water agree. Both say danger, and people stay out. A red flag on water that looks like a swimming pool creates a contradiction, and people resolve the contradiction in favor of the thing they can see. And remember, the cruelest part of the mechanism. The single red flag flies most often on precisely the days when the rip currents are strongest and the surface looks calmest, because a steady, moderate swell that pumps the rips hard does not build the tall, obviously frightening breakers that would make the flag believable. So the days of highest danger are the days the warning is least convincing, because the water is doing its lethal work invisibly, out at the sandbar, in a current with no surface drama at all. The flag and the water are telling the truth. They just appear to a tired family from Tennessee to be contradicting each other, and the family believes the water. Then there is the phrase itself, the official meaning of that single red flag, high hazard, dangerous currents. And crucially, the beach remains open. Swim at your own risk. Sit with what that phrase does inside a person's head. It is not a prohibition. It is a permission slip with a warning label. It hands the decision back to the individual, and in doing so, it quietly tells them that the decision is theirs to make, that reasonable people might go in, that this is a matter of personal judgment rather than a closed door. A closed door, a double red, the beach is closed, you will be fined, removes the choice, and removing the choice is precisely what saves lives, because the whole problem is that the people making the choice do not have the information to make it well. But single red does the opposite. It formalizes the choice, and then leaves the least informed people on the beach to make it. on the day the danger is highest and looks lowest. At the end of a vacation, they have every reason not to waste. It is almost perfectly designed to fail, not because anyone intended it to, but because it asks people to override the evidence of their own eyes on the strength of a warning they have no framework to believe. And the forecasting behind the flags, good as it is, runs into the same wall. The National Weather Service issues genuine rip current risk forecasts for this coast, rating the day's risk as low, moderate, or high before anyone leaves the hotel. And those forecasts are real science built on real understanding of surf and swell and tide. But a risk forecast is a statement of probability, not of certainty. And probability is the one thing human beings are worst at acting on. A forecast that says the rip current risk is high today does not say that you will be caught. It says the conditions that produce dangerous currents are present, that more of them will fire, that the odds are elevated. To a person standing on the sand looking at calm water, elevated risk is almost infinitely easy to discount because they can always tell themselves, and they are not even wrong statistically for any single dip, that the odds of it being them in the next 20 minutes in the small patch of water where their kids are playing are still low. The forecast is accurate, and the flag is honest, and the sign explains the danger, and none of it can close the gap between a probability written on a chart and a family's certainty about the water they are looking at. That is why the rescues and the deaths coexist in the same season, the same week, sometimes the same day. In 2023, the lifeguards and first responders here pulled something like 237 people out of the water alive, an enormous number of saves. Proof that the system works hard and works often? And in the same stretch of coast, in the same conditions, 7 people drowned, because the system is a fraction of the coast, and the warnings are a symbol against the evidence of the eyes. And the arithmetic of that gap is not going to change as long as the water keeps looking like exactly what it is not. And the deaths are not spread evenly across the year, which tells you something final about how the trap is baited. They cluster, and they cluster in the same window, the late spring into the early summer. And the clustering is not random. It is 3 separate curves peaking at once. The first is the water temperature. By May and June, the Gulf here has warmed to bathwater, warm enough that nobody hesitates to get in and stay in. So the number of people actually immersed in the water climbs steeply. The second is the crowd. The biggest crowds of the year arrive in exactly this window. The tail of spring break running into the school-is-out rush and the long holiday weekends that open the summer. So the sheer count of bodies on the beach and in the water peaks. And the third is the surf itself. This is a season when the weather patterns over the Gulf commonly produce the moderate, persistent swells. Those unremarkable 2 to 4 foot sets that a tourist calls a beautiful, calm day. That are precisely the conditions that pump the rip currents hardest. Stack those 3 curves and their peaks land on top of each other. The warmest inviting water, the largest inland crowds, and the swell pattern most efficient at manufacturing invisible current, all converging on the same handful of weeks. That is why June, over and over, is when the count climbs. Not because the coast changes its nature in June, but because June is when it arranges for the most people who cannot read the water to be standing in the most of it on the days it is working hardest to kill them. So this is the everyday face of the deadliest beach in America. A steady, quiet, year-after-year bleed of 1s and 2s, and in a bad week, 7s, under flags that fly and forecasts that publish and signs that explain, defeated every time by the simple fact that the water looks safe, and the people looking at it have no reason built into them to believe otherwise. It is a slow-motion emergency that never quite becomes a headline, because it never happens all at once. But this same coast, this same fine sand and flat slope and shallow shelf, has another mode entirely. A mode where the danger stops being a quiet bleed and becomes, in the space of a single day, the largest catastrophe the region has ever seen. Everything up to this point has been about the water on an ordinary day, the quiet, sunlit, everyday version of the danger, the one that kills in ones and twos under a flag that most people ignore. But the same shape of coast that makes the everyday water so deceptive does something else, something the summer crowds never see. And to understand the Panhandle completely, you have to see what this geography does when the weather stops being calm and starts being the worst thing the Gulf can build. Because the flatness is not just a summer trap. The flatness is a machine for turning a storm into a catastrophe. And on the 10th of October 2018, that machine ran at full capacity. Start with the same fact that started everything. This is a low, flat coast, and the seafloor off it is a broad, shallow, gently sloping shelf. On a summer afternoon, that shelf is why the water looks like a swimming pool. In a hurricane, that identical shelf is why the water comes ashore like nothing the people here had ever imagined. Because a shallow shelf is the single most efficient amplifier of storm surge on the planet. Understand the mechanism, and you understand why the same trait that draws the tourists also drowned a town. Storm surge is not a wave. It is a dome of seawater that a hurricane pushes ahead of itself, piled up by the wind shoving on the sea surface, and lifted slightly by the storm's low pressure. Out in deep water, that dome has somewhere to go. The water pushed down simply flows away underneath. But when that mountain of water moves up onto a shallow shelf, the shallow bottom blocks the escape route. The water cannot flow away beneath itself anymore because there is no beneath. There is sand a few feet down, so it stacks. It piles higher and higher as it is forced into shallower and shallower water, and then it runs up over a coast that has almost no elevation to stop it, because the same flat coastal plain that makes the beach so gentle also means there is no high ground for miles. A steep coast with deep water offshore takes a surge badly. A flat coast with a shallow shelf takes it catastrophically. And the northern Gulf is about as flat and shallow as coastlines come. And the flatness does one more thing that the beachgoers never think about, because it is invisible on a calm day. It means the surge does not stop at the beach. On a coast with dunes and bluffs and rising ground behind the shore, a surge runs up against elevation and is halted. It floods the low front and then hits a wall of higher land and can go no further. This coast has almost no higher land. The same flat coastal plain that makes the beach so gentle to walk into extends inland for miles at barely any elevation at all, which means that when the surge comes up over the dune line, it does not hit a wall. It keeps going. The water pushes inland across the flat ground, into streets and neighborhoods, and everything built on the assumption that the water stays where the water usually is, and there is no natural high ground close by to run to, no ridge a mile inland where a family could shelter above the flood. The coast that a surge drowns here is not a thin strip at the water's edge. It is a wide band of low ground reaching well back from the beach, and the flatness that sells the swimming is the exact flatness that leaves an entire community with nowhere uphill to go. The geography that removes the swimmer's options in 30 seconds removes the town's options too at the scale of a hurricane by taking away the one thing that would let people simply climb above the water: height. Now add the storm itself, and here is where the Panhandle's cruelest signature, the calm that gives way with no time to react, appears at the scale of a hurricane instead of a swimmer. Hurricane Michael did not give the coast the days of warning that let people make careful, unhurried decisions. It did something that meteorologists have a clinical name for and a genuine fear of: rapid intensification. A tropical system moving north across the Gulf toward the Panhandle passed over water that was unusually warm, deep, warm water that acts as fuel, and it encountered almost nothing to disrupt it: low wind shear, the kind of clean atmospheric environment that lets a storm organize and breathe. Warm water is the fuel, and wind shear is the brake, and Michael had a full tank and no brakes. So in the roughly day and a half before landfall, it did not just grow. It exploded, strengthening hour over hour, its central pressure falling, and its winds climbing on a timeline that outran the forecasts people had already made their plans around. And this is the part that matters more than any wind speed number. People evacuate or decide not to, based on the storm that is forecast, not the storm that arrives. Families along that coast went to bed having heard one thing and woke to something categorically worse, bearing down with hours, not days, to spare. The storm outran the category people had prepared for: compressed decision time. The exact thing that kills the individual swimmer who has 30 seconds to realize he is in a current and choose correctly is also the thing that killed people at the scale of a whole coastline. And it came from the same source, a threat that reveals its true size far too late to answer. When Michael came ashore near Mexico Beach and Tyndall Air Force Base just east of Panama City, it did so with sustained winds of about 160 miles an hour and a central pressure around 919 millibars. And here is a reversal that tells you exactly how hard this coast is to read, even for the professionals whose entire job is reading it. At the time of landfall, the National Hurricane Center classified Michael as a Category 4, a very high-end Category 4, but a 4. It was only months later, in the April 2019 post-storm analysis, when the scientists went back through all the data, the surface observations, the radar, the damage surveys, everything that came in during and after the storm, that they concluded the winds had actually reached Category 5 strength at landfall, and they upgraded it. Michael became one of the small handful of Category 5 hurricanes ever to strike the United States, and the people who lived through it had lived through a Category 5 without even being told, at the time, that that was what it was. Think about what that means. The strongest storm to hit that coast in recorded history was underestimated as it happened, by the best tools available, and only revealed as its true self in retrospect. It is the Tarpon all over again, at the scale of a hurricane. The Panhandle killing not with a threat everyone saw coming, but with one whose real magnitude only became clear after it had already done the damage. The surge that shallow shelf delivered was on the order of 14 feet at the coast near Mexico Beach. 14 feet of seawater. Not a wave that comes and goes, but a rising, moving flood that came up over the dunes and into the town and kept coming, driven by that 160-mile-an-hour wind. Translate 14 feet into human terms, and it is not a number. It is the roofline of a single-story house. It is water above the top of the front door, above the windows, deep enough to lift a building off its foundation and carry it, deep enough that there is no room above it inside an ordinary home. Mexico Beach was a small, low, unpretentious town built right down on that flat coast, and the water and wind together did to it something close to erasure. Of the roughly 1,692 buildings in Mexico Beach, about 1,584 were damaged, and 809 of them were destroyed outright, not damaged, not flooded, but gone, reduced to slabs and debris fields where houses had stood that morning. Picture a town of 1,700 buildings, and understand that more than half of them simply ceased to exist in the space of a few hours. That is what a shallow shelf and a flat coast and a storm that arrived bigger than forecast can do when they combine. The wind left its own record, and one instrument tells the story better than any statistic. At Tyndall Air Force Base, right in the path, an anemometer. The device built specifically to measure wind speed recorded a gust of 139 miles an hour, and then it failed. It broke. The instrument whose only job was to measure the wind was destroyed by the wind it was measuring at 139, and the true peak gusts that came after it went dark were higher, unmeasured, because the machine that would have measured them was already gone. There is something almost unbearably fitting about that on this coast, a place whose entire deadly character is that it exceeds what its own instruments and its own visitors are prepared to read. The anemometer failing at 139 is the hurricane scale version of the swimmer, who realizes too late, the captain who held his course, the forecast that said Category 4. The measurement always arrives a step behind the reality here. The reclassification deserves a closer look, because how they arrived at it says everything about how hard this coast is to measure, even for the people whose profession is measuring it. When the National Hurricane Center goes back after a storm to determine its true strength, it cannot simply read a number off a gauge, because the gauges, like Tyndall's anemometer at 139 miles an hour, tend to break at exactly the moment the strongest winds arrive. Direct wind measurements from inside the worst of a hurricane are almost always sparse, because the instruments do not survive the thing they are built to observe. So the analysts reconstruct the storm's true intensity from everything else: aircraft reconnaissance data gathered before landfall, radar, the central pressure, and, critically, the pattern of damage on the ground. Structural engineers study how buildings failed and infer the wind speeds required to fail them that way. And when they did that work for Michael and published it in April 2019, the evidence pointed to sustained winds of about 160 miles an hour at landfall, over the threshold that separates a Category 4 from a Category 5. The storm had been a 5 the whole time. The instruments just could not stay alive long enough to say so, and it took 6 months of careful reconstruction to prove what the ruins had been quietly recording all along. Put Michael in its historical company, and the enormity of it becomes clear. A Category 5 hurricane making landfall on the United States is one of the rarest events in American weather. In the entire record, only a small handful have ever done it. The Labor Day hurricane of 1935 in the Florida Keys, Camille on the Mississippi coast in 1969, Andrew in South Florida in 1992, and then Michael. That is essentially the whole list. Michael was the first Category 5 to strike the country in the 26 years since Andrew, and the most intense hurricane on record ever to hit the Florida Panhandle, a stretch of coast that had absorbed plenty of storms over the centuries, but had never, in all the years of measurement, taken a blow at this strength. The people living there in October of 2018 were not careless or unprepared for hurricanes in general. They had lived through hurricanes. They had evacuated before and come back to intact houses and told themselves reasonably that they knew what these storms did. And none of that experience had prepared them for a Category 5, because a Category 5 had never come here. And the storm that finally did arrive was a category the entire community's collective memory had no template for. The gap between a Category 4 and a Category 5 is not a small step up, and this is where translating the number into force matters. The energy a wind carries does not grow in step with its speed. It grows with the square of the speed, and the destructive force climbs even faster than that. So the difference between a strong storm and an extreme one is not a little worse. It is a different world. A wind at 160 miles an hour does not simply damage more of what a 100-mile-an-hour wind damages. It fails structures that would have stood in a lesser storm, peels roofs, then walls, then lifts whole light-frame buildings off their foundations and disintegrates them. The ordinary coastal homes of Mexico Beach, built to the standards that had always been good enough for the storms that had always come, were not built for this, because nothing in the region's history said they needed to be. That is why 809 of them did not just flood, but were destroyed outright, reduced to bare concrete slabs and scattered debris. The surge took the lower floors, and the wind took what the surge did not, and between them, they did not damage the town so much as unmake large parts of it. And there is one detail from Mexico Beach that captures the entire lesson of this coast in a single standing structure. In the middle of the devastation, a small number of houses survived largely intact, and the most famous of them was a home that had been deliberately engineered, at real expense, to withstand winds far beyond anything the building codes required, anchored deep, built high on strong pilings, designed by its owners specifically for the worst-case storm that everyone else assumed would never come. It rode out Michael while the ordinary houses around it were swept away. That house is not an inspiring story. It is an indictment. It proves that survival on this coast, in the catastrophic mode, was available, but only to someone who refused the comfortable assumption that the past was a guide to the future, and spent accordingly, and built for a storm the record said would not arrive. Everyone who trusted the history, everyone who built to the standard that had always sufficed, lost. The one who built for the impossible kept their house. The coast rewards, in a hurricane exactly as on a calm afternoon, only the people who do not believe what their experience is telling them. At Tyndall Air Force Base, in the direct path just east of Panama City, the same forces did the same work on some of the most expensive hardware the country owns. Tyndall was a base built around advanced fighter aircraft, and the storm tore into its hangars and buildings and damaged aircraft that had been left behind, sheltered in structures that were never designed for a Category 5, because no one designs a Florida Panhandle airbase for a category that had never hit the Florida Panhandle. The anemometer that failed at 139 belonged to that world of careful instrumentation, and it went dark early, and everything the base recorded after that moment came from a wind whose true peak was never measured, only survived. A military installation, hardened and organized and staffed by professionals, was gutted by the same storm and the same shallow shelf geography that fills the summer beaches with families who cannot swim. The coast does not distinguish between the tourist and the fighter wing. It applies the same physics to both. Most hurricanes make their bargain with the land quickly. They come ashore. They lose their fuel. The warm ocean water that powered them is behind them now, and they weaken fast, downgrading from hurricane to tropical storm within hours of landfall as the friction of the land and the loss of that ocean heat tears them apart. Michael refused the bargain. It came ashore at Category 5 strength and drove inland still ferociously organized, still a hurricane, carrying its winds far from the coast into southwest Georgia and beyond, into a region that considers itself safely interior, hundreds of miles from any beach, and had no cultural memory of a hurricane arriving with that kind of force. It flattened pecan orchards and cotton fields at the height of harvest, ruined a huge share of Georgia's standing crops in a single afternoon, tore roofs off inland towns, and killed people well away from the water, in a part of the country where the ocean is an abstraction and a hurricane is something that happens to other states. The compressed decision time that trapped people on the coast reached inland too, because a family 200 miles from the Gulf does not evacuate for a hurricane. That is not a decision they have ever had to make, and Michael arrived before that calculation could change. The storm carried the coast's signature trait, a threat larger than anyone's template for it, arriving faster than the reaction it required, deep into the interior, and imposed it on people who had never thought of themselves as living on a dangerous coast at all. The human toll of Michael is a number that surprises people, and the surprise is itself instructive. 16 people died as direct deaths of the storm, killed by the wind, the surge, the collapse of buildings, the immediate violence of the event. For a Category 5 that flattened a town, 16 can sound almost low, and it would be a mistake to read it that way, because the low direct toll was not a sign that the storm was survivable. It was a sign of how much warning still got out in time, How many people did leave? How much a modern evacuation, even a rushed, compressed one, can accomplish before the water arrives. It is the difference between the individual and the system written large. The individual swimmer on this coast dies because he is alone with 30 seconds of decision and no one to pull him out, while the coast as a whole, facing a hurricane, has forecasters and emergency managers and evacuation orders and interstate highways, and that machinery, imperfect and outrun as it was, still moved enough people out of the way that a storm which destroyed 800 buildings killed 16 people directly rather than hundreds. The mandatory evacuation orders went out. The interstates carried people inland, emergency managers, racing a storm that was strengthening faster than their plans had assumed, got the warning out, and got a great many people gone before the surge came up over the dunes. The property damage ran to something on the order of $25 billion. The lives were saved, mostly, by getting out. And the ones who were lost were so often the ones for whom the compressed timeline meant the decision to leave came a few hours too late to be safe. And a storm does not end when the wind stops. What follows is its own emergency, and it exposes the last and most permanent truth about this coast. Help, when the worst happens, has to cross a landscape that the storm has just destroyed. After Michael, the roads into Mexico Beach and the hardest-hit stretches were buried under debris, blocked by downed trees and power lines, and the wreckage of the buildings themselves. And the power and the cell networks were gone across a wide area. Rescue and recovery crews could not simply drive to where the people were. They had to cut their way in, clear the roads foot by foot, search collapsed and flooded structures one at a time, work without communications, across a zone where every familiar landmark had been erased or rearranged. The recognition that people needed help, the authorization and organization of the response, the physical travel across a shattered landscape, the search of each ruined building, the delay imposed by every blocked mile of road. It is the same anatomy of rescue that plays out when a single swimmer is caught 50 yards offshore, only stretched across an entire county. Rescue is never the miracle of help simply appearing. It is a chain of recognition and travel and access and time. And on this flat, exposed, easily cut off coast, every link in that chain is longer than it looks on a calm day. And when the wind finally dropped and people could come back out, the scale of what had happened stopped being a matter of wind speed and became a matter of how many lives no longer had a place to return to. 809 destroyed buildings in Mexico Beach alone is not an abstraction. It is 809 households whose homes were simply gone, and thousands more up and down the coast whose houses still stood but were roofless, gutted, or marooned in ruined neighborhoods with no power, no water, and no passable road. A whole community was displaced in a single morning. People living in cars and tents pitched on their own bare slabs, in shelters inland, in temporary trailers that stretched on for months and, for some, for years. The storm itself lasted a few hours. The condition it created lasted a very long time because a coast this exposed does not merely take a harder hit than a sheltered one. It takes far longer to come back, since everything has to be rebuilt from the foundation up in a place where the next storm is always part of the arithmetic. For a while, the deadliest beach in America was not dangerous at all, because there was almost no one left living on the stretch of it the storm had chosen. It was simply empty, but it did not stay empty. The coast did the thing it always does, the thing that closes the loop between the hurricane and the calm afternoon. It rebuilt, and the people came back. Mexico Beach, more than half of it gone, did not become a ghost town. It cleared its slabs and hauled away its debris and began, house by house, to put itself back. Because the reasons people had built there in the first place had not gone anywhere. The water was still warm and clear and green. The sand was still the finest, whitest sand in America. The economy of the coast still ran on the millions of visitors who wanted exactly that, and the visitors still wanted it. And so the condos went back up, and the rentals refilled, and the beach that had been erased became, within a few short years, a beach again, full of families from 400 miles inland who had not been there in 2018 and for whom the storm was a story, if they knew it at all. This is not a criticism of those people. It is the deepest truth about this coast, the one that ties the drownings and the hurricane into a single pattern. The danger here is permanent because it is built into the shape of the land. But so is the attraction, and it is built into the very same shape. The fine sand that makes the deadly shallows makes the beautiful beach. The flat coast that amplifies the surge is the flat coast that gives you that endless, gentle, waiting water. You cannot have one without the other, because they are not two things. And so people return and rebuild and return again, not out of foolishness, but because the reasons to come are exactly as durable as the reasons to be afraid. And the reasons to come are the ones you can see from the balcony. So what does this shape of coast actually do when you lay all of it side by side? It does one thing over and over at every scale. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It compresses the time between warning and consequence until there is not enough of it left to act. That is the Panhandle's true signature. Not the sand, not the currents, not the storms individually, but the way this specific geography, this fine sand and flat slope and shallow shelf and low coastal plain, takes every thread it produces and hides its true size until the moment for a good decision has already passed. The swimmer gets 30 seconds. The captain got a night. The town got a day and a half instead of the 3 days a slower storm would have granted. In every case, the coast looked manageable right up until it wasn't. And in every case, the people involved were not fools. They were reading the situation with the best information they had. And the coast had arranged, through nothing but its physical shape, for that information to arrive late. Pull the whole chain into one line and it becomes almost unbearably clear. Fine quartz sand, ground from Appalachian rock, and carried down the Apalachicola over ages, makes a beach of nearly uniform, ultra-fine grains. Ultra-fine grains make an extraordinarily low, flat beach slope. The flat slope keeps the water shallow far out, so it looks like a pool. And the same flat slope builds multiple parallel sandbars with troughs between them. 2 to 4 foot waves break on the outer bar and pour water into the trough. And the trapped water drains sideways and fires back out to sea through the gaps as narrow, fast rip currents. Strongest cruelly, on the days the surf looks gentlest. Into that invisible danger come millions of visitors a year from the inland south. People who learn to swim in pools and lakes and have no vocabulary for reading surf, no instinct for a current that runs away from shore. When one of them is caught, the people who love them go in after them. And the current that took the first victim takes the rescuers, because the rescue instinct is the real killing mechanism here, and the trained rescuer is almost never present. Only 3 guarded stands along the 27 miles of Panama City Beach, on a barrier shore that runs for more than 200, and the very same low shelf and flat coastal plain that make the everyday swimming look so easy are what turn a hurricane surge into a 14-foot flood over a town, and what let a storm arrive as a Category 5 that had been forecast as something less, with the decision time already spent. It is all one system. The beauty and the danger were never two things. They are the same fact, seen on a calm day and seen on the worst day, and the fact does not change. Only the weather does. That is why the deaths keep coming, year after year, on the deadliest beach in America, and why they will keep coming. Not because people are careless. Most of them are careful, by every standard they know. Not because the warnings don't exist. The flags fly, the forecasts publish, the ordinance carries a fine and the threat of jail. The deaths keep coming because the reasons keep coming. The sand is still Appalachian quartz, milled to powder. The slope is still nearly flat. The bars still build, and the rips still fire through the gaps on the gentlest days. The inland South still points its cars at the one coast that looks safe, and the people who love a drowning stranger will still always go in after them. The system that makes this place lethal is not a mistake anyone can fix, because it is not a mistake. It is geology and physics and love, arranged by the shape of a coastline into a trap that resets itself every single day the sun comes out and the water goes flat and clear and green and beautiful. Stand on that beach on a bright afternoon, and here is what you will see. A single red flag snapping in a light breeze over an empty lifeguard tower, on a stretch of sand where there is no lifeguard because there are only 3 guarded stands along 27 miles, and this is not one of them. The water beyond it is calm. It is clear. It is the color of green glass, and it does not look like anything at all. Not like the storm that erased a town down the coast. Not like the current running out through a gap in a sandbar you cannot see. Not like the thing that took a steamship captain who beat the Gulf 1,700 times. Or a 19-year-old. Or 3 men who had been in town for a matter of hours. And walking down toward it, across sand so fine it squeaks under their feet, carrying towels and a cooler and a boogie board, comes a family from 400 miles inland who have driven all night to get here and who are looking at the safest, most beautiful water they have ever seen.